that Howard emailed me at the last minute and asked me to provide some introduction for Sam Molnar's talk, precisely because it's a talk whose topic is of extreme interest to me. Somebody who has studied some of the background of Jewish socialism and Jewish anarchism, mostly in the United States, and as somebody who's been intimately involved in the Bernie Sanders campaign. So a lot of the themes that I imagine Sam will be talking about today are themes that very much inform both my scholarship and my activism. So I'm interested in that. And fortuitously enough, and Sam will make some reference to this, for those of you who read the Village Voice, there was an article in the most recent Village Voice called "The Heresy and Evangelism of Bernie Sanders." And so it's a wonderful, interesting piece that Sam, I guess, is going to make some reference to. But I'd recommend that you take a look at it. It'll probably be very provocative for some folks, but it's an interesting thematic line, I think, to what Sam will be talking about today. So hopefully many of you know Sam Molnar. He's currently a Sea Grant Fellow at the Great Lakes Commission, where he provides technical support for water quality data and information architectures and leads research on how Great Lakes cities can adapt to climate change. And while in grad school, he helped to found the campaign for an open Hillel at the University of Michigan, and he's an alum of Wayne State University's Public Affairs program. Sam, the floor is now yours.
Hello, everyone. First off, it's great to be at Wayne State and on the same floor as the Peace and Conflict Studies Department, which is where I took my first Jewish Studies class at Wayne State, was in the Peace and Conflict Studies Department with Sapir Handelman, who maybe some of you remember. So I thought we'd start, I just introduced myself a little bit. I'm not a scholar of history or Jewish studies or the Bund or any of those things. Like Fran mentioned, my day job is doing water science at the Great Lakes Commission. While I was studying at the University of Michigan for grad school, I found myself in the middle of a battle on student government, which I didn't plan to be a part of, over the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and consequently an open Hillel campaign that happened. And last May, I was on a panel with Professor Lupovich at the Birmingham Temple, and Professor Lupovich offered, well, why don't you do a brown bag about something? And so I had to come up with something on the spot, and I just read Peter Beinart's article about Bundism among young people in America. I thought, well, that's an interesting topic. Maybe I could talk about that. And Howard graciously agreed, and luckily, about a week after that, the Bernie Sanders campaign started. And so when we had originally planned to do this, we didn't think it would be about Bernie Sanders at all. And in fact, I was sort of resistant to bringing him into it too much. But sometimes you just got to take advantage of what's timely. I think that the Sanders campaign is giving us a lot of fodder to examine this moment in the North American diaspora of Jews. And so that could be really interesting, and it's a good opportunity to step back and actually look at the moment that we're in. So why don't we sort of dive in. As Fran mentioned, this was great that the Village Voice published it this week. I don't know what I would have done without this, actually. So this is the cover of the Village Voice this week. The tagline is, "In a Zionist age, the burn kicks at old shul." And you'll notice that someone's throwing a bagel at his face. Well, who throws bagels? Jews throw bagels. And why are the Jews throwing a bagel at their own candidate? One of the things that really sets Bernie apart from the Jewish establishment is that his Jewish identity isn't referential to Israel. When Bernie is asked about his Jewishness, he says a number of things, but one of the things he almost always starts by talking about is by talking about the Holocaust. and what the lessons of the Holocaust are for him. So Jesse Meyerson, who is one of the founding activists in the Occupy Wall Street movement, wrote this article. There's a handful of copies, Fran, you want to maybe
Sure.
send them around. People are welcome to take them home and read them. So I thought we'd start by reading just a little passage from that. So this is what Jesse wrote. We shouldn't be surprised by the insistence that Bernie invoked the Holocaust. Museums, schools, and culture generally have so diligently cultivated the image of Jews as primarily survivors of the Holocaust that we've learned to see this and not all that solidarity talk as properly Jewish. But Sanders carries on a Jewish tradition much longer and more sacred than merely paying lip service to the Holocaust. His every utterance about universal health care, economic inequality, and social justice relentlessly embraces Judaism. It's just a Judaism that many people no longer recognize. Bernie Sanders is a Jew of a different era, the kind of Jew that Zionists would very much like us to forget. The New York of Sanders' childhood was full of Yiddish socialists, and often these were Jews of Sanders' sort, their spiritual practice less fixated on giving glory to God on high than fighting for emancipation here on earth. Although that interpretation of Judaism may seem profane or even blasphemous at first blush, it has a firm basis in Scripture. Okay, so we'll actually talk a little bit about that Scripture towards the end. But first, we need to recognize that there's a fundamental tension right now at the center of Jewish life. And part of this is the fact that you have, on the one hand, Israel held up as the core of Jewish identity. And then on the other hand, you have, in non-Orthodox circles, so generally we're going to be talking about non-Orthodox circles today, a sort of social justice Judaism as the main form of education in Jewish schools, and day schools and Hebrew schools. And you have this tension between Israel after the collapse of Oslo and what Jewish students are taught what Judaism means in their schools. And you also have Israel as the center of Jewish life, so they can't sort of, as much as perhaps Jewish people want to escape Israel, they can't. It's the center of their identity, whether they like it or not. And so you have Jews who, sometimes it's said that Jews are running away from Israel, but in fact, Jews who critique Israel are running towards it. And at schools like Vassar, the leading BDS advocates are Jews. And so why is this happening, right? Because between this tension, you're getting a psychological condition which is called cognitive dissonance, which was originally sort of thought through by Leon Festinger himself, the son of what he described in his biography, a radical atheist Russian immigrant. And so Festinger said, when you have this sort of two ideas that are equally true in your mind and you're holding them together, there's a series of things that you can do. And you can do one of them or you can do all of them. You can change your attitudes, you can acquire new information, or you can reduce the relative importance of your cognitions. And by doing that, you're allowing your social justice Judaism and your Israel after the collapse of Oslo to, instead of being in opposition to each other, to try to get them to work together. And so that's the solution to this cognitive dissonance, this psychological condition. For a lot of people, this cognitive dissonance really became a turning point was in 2009 Operation Cast Lead. I mean, if you go and sit in these groups of young Jews and ask them, what was the turning point for you? 8 out of 10 mouths will say Gaza. And I think that's a really important key turning point. And we see this change in a famous survey, not the Pew survey, which everybody likes to talk about. We'll get to that one. But a survey that was actually funded by Bronfman. And they asked Jews, are you comfortable with the idea of a Jewish state? Okay, you can see the difference between old and young Jews. And then I think the most jarring statistic here is the question, would the destruction of Israel be a personal tragedy for you? And for Jews under 35, less than half agreed with that. And I was actually surprised by that. I thought that was higher or lower than I thought it would be. So this is based on a couple of things. One is, as we talked about earlier, the memory of the Holocaust and how it's taught about and educated about. For Jews born after 1980, Holocaust education is crucial to the Jewish education that they have. And while there's some militarism in education about the Holocaust, the key message and the essential lesson that comes out of all of the museums and classes is that to create an other, to create a stranger from your society, is what causes genocide, and that's the root of evil. And so that's the lesson that this group of people born after 1980 were taught. And as the rawness of the Holocaust has sort of passed for this younger cohort, they're able to examine it with that lens, with that sort of cool lens. And also, the formative memories of Israel are just vastly different. So for people in Fran's generation, George's generation, the formative memories of Israel are the unification of Jerusalem, the founding of socialist kibbutzim. For people in David's generation, the formative memories of Israel are attacks on Gaza, security walls, intifada. And so this leads to a whole new understanding for young Jews about their place in the world, and that's changing the face of Jewishness in the diaspora. But this concept is not so new, right? So what's old is new again, right? And one of the places we see this sort of cross-generational solidarity is in the Open Hillel campaign, which we'll talk about more, but I want to introduce it here. This picture is from when these three people on the left, they're civil rights activists. Larry Rubin, Dorothy Zellner, and Ira Grouper were part of SNCC, and later became activists against the occupation. And so Open Hillel, their first true nationwide campaign was to bring these three activists to campuses to talk to young Jews about the relationship between the sort of social justice Judaism that's taught and Israel and Palestine. And at U of M, where this picture was taken, the students wrote an op-ed asking for an Open Hillel. And the headline here, as in 1948, so too in 2014, that was one of the lines in the op-ed that they wrote, that in 1948, the then anti-Zionist American Council for Judaism wanted to be a part of the Hillel umbrella. So Hillels locally wrote to the national organization and asked, can we have an anti-Zionist as a part of the Hillel umbrella? And Hillel in 1948 wrote back, quote, Hillel represents the total Jewish community on each campus which it serves. It excludes no student activity which legitimately represents the interests of a group of students, so long as they accept the principle of community responsibility. Just as there's Orthodox, conservative, and Reform outlooks represented in the Hillel program, so too can there be both Zionist and anti-Zionist outlooks. And so the phrase then is, as it was in 1948, so too in 2014. And of course, in this moment, we also have the favorite elder of young American Jews, Bernie Sanders, enter in stage left, right? And another, in Haaretz this week, the headline was, Sanders' Middle East policy shows he's the true voice on Israel for young U.S. Jews. That was written by Benji Cannon, who's the president of J Street's university chapters. So Open Hillel is a reaction to this condition of cognitive dissonance. So you either change your attitude, you acquire or seek out new information, or you reduce the relative importance of your cognitions. So some Jews have dealt with this cognitive dissonance. There's a significant portion by becoming more conservative politically in other realms of their life. But there's a large subset that has done the opposite and has sought out new information and sought to change their attitudes. And I think it's important here to recognize that Jews could organize against the occupation in plenty of secular groups. There's plenty of Palestinian solidarity groups they could be a part of, but for the vast majority of Jews who want to do something about the occupation, they do it as Jews. And this has done two things. One, it's mended some of the cognitive dissonance that exists in their psyche and allowed them to bring their Judaism and their opposition to the occupation together. And it's also led to organizing relationships and organizations which address politics Jewishly, even if those politics aren't about Israel. So the challenge in seeking new information about Israel and Palestine on North American campuses has not gone without immense opposition from the establishment. Open Hillel itself started when a group of Jewish students wanted to bring Jewish anti-occupation voices to the Harvard Hillel to speak. And they were doing it in partnership with the Palestine Solidarity Committee on campus. And a few days before the event was supposed to happen in 2013, Harvard Hillel pulled out and said you can't have it here because it's with the PSC. And that's because of these what's called the Standards of Partnership, which is a policy that was written by a consulting group that also has contracts with Carl Rove and Dick Cheney and all of our favorite people for Hillel, and they wrote what's called the Standards of Partnership. So the Standards of Partnership say Hillel will not partner with, house, or host organizations, groups, or speakers as a matter of policy or practice, and any one of these things. So deny the right of Israel to exist, delegitimize, demonize, or apply a double standard to Israel, support, boycott, divestment from, or sanctions against the state of Israel, or exhibit a pattern of disruptive behavior, yada yada. And so the function of the Standards of Partnership is not just to exclude groups like the Progressive Jewish Alliance from inside of Hillel, but it also prevents Jewish groups who have any semblance of funding from Hillel, which is basically all of them, from partnering with Palestinian student groups, because Palestinian student groups almost always support BDS. And so they're unable to form these partnerships, which students generally want to have. And it also excludes groups like Rabbis for Human Rights in some cases, which supports boycott of the settlements. And ultimately, though, the main effect of this is to drive a wedge through the Jewish community, with pluralism on one side and toe-the-line Zionism on the other side. And for students in the center, or the center-left, the effect is to push them out of Hillels and out of the organized Jewish communities' arms into groups with broader agendas. Often these groups embrace agendas around economic inequality or socialism, right? So this is back to the question of cognitive dissonance. As one belief changes, more information is sought and more beliefs change. So if being Jewish meant being Zionist before, now students find themselves questioning Zionism. And then they also start to question other parts of their Jewish identity. And many of them are discovering a history of anti or non-Zionism, especially for the majority of them who are Ashkenazi, and they're finding a socialist history. In particular, the Jewish Workers' Bund is a topic of conversation among these groups often. Now, like I said, I'm not a scholar of Jewish studies, and no one's done a survey on this, to my knowledge. But this is just, my experience being inside these groups and watching the chatter on listservs. Let me do a little more reading about the moment that this is in American Judaism. David Gerson, who wrote the book, What Do You Buy the Terrorist Who Bombed Your Wife? What do you buy the children of the terrorist who attacked your wife, or something like that? So he was at this Open Hillel conference in 2014, where hundreds of students came, and he wrote about what this moment means. And I thought I would just read it for you. So David wrote, on Saturday night, I looked out upon a standing room only audience, people fidgeting and giddy, barely able to conceal the significance of what was about to occur. I was on stage, the hall at Harvard University electric and buzzing, flanked by 3 distinguished professors. The 4 of us representing various streams of Zionist, post-Zionist, and anti-Zionist thought. At first, I was awed by the company I had been asked to join, thinking, what on earth am I doing here? That thought was quickly replaced by another as the room erupted with boisterous cheers when a student organizer stepped to the podium. This is a historic moment, I thought. I tweeted this when the feeling came over me, and the thought 5 days removed, I still deeply believed. So what occurred which was so historic? This. On Saturday night, a grassroots-led and student-driven movement called Open Hillel launched a 3-day conference determined to create what Jewish institutions have largely refused to permit. Dynamic spaces where both Zionists and anti-Zionists can come together and discuss Israel as equals, with equally valued perspectives as respected members of the American Jewish community. These Jewish Americans who represent significantly growing numbers symbolically knocked on the door of institutional Jewish organizations and yelled, "We are the Jewish community, and you will either embrace us or embrace a fear of dialogue, the least of Jewish things, and the shrinking numbers such a fear will bring." And so this symbolic door knocking was later followed up with real door knocking, when students from this group, and if not now, went to United Jewish Philanthropies in Philadelphia, knocked on the door, weren't let in, and Federation in New York and Boston. But what's more interesting about this is that there was a rejection from the mainstream. And when you have a rejection from the mainstream, what happens is instead of assimilating into the culture of the mainstream, you create your own counterculture. And there's a distinct counterculture around these groups that has popped up. And it has a distinct flavor that tastes really familiar to the Yiddish socialism of old Europe. And so, well, how is that? Well, first of all, it's a Jewish counterculture. And I think if we want to think about how these cultures are creating a unique counterculture with this sort of retro flavor, you might want to think about these different cultures existing like bacteria in a petri dish. So if you have different bacteria cultures in a room, and the wind blows, they'll cross-pollinate each other. And so you have this youth subculture, this youth sub-Jewish culture going on. At the same time that you have the emergence of an internet culture, where there's broad and virtually free access to the World Wide Web. And nationalism, and Zionism is a nationalist project, nationalism is a virtually impossible or very difficult project to sustain with the World Wide Web. The broad access that people in North America have to understand the stranger, right? This concept to understand what before was the other. With the internet, you can see more clearly the hell that is war and occupation. And also connect with and understand the suffering of Palestinians more than any generation before the institution of the World Wide Web. And this collision is not just happening between this Jewish subculture and internet culture, but it's also colliding into the youth culture of after the Great Recession. For these young people, the realities of social injustice on an unprecedented scale, massive inequalities and a loss of trust in elites, these define their political moment and their upbringing, and rightly so. And so when these sort of, so here you have a universalism, right, a humanism that emerges from the internet culture. You have a real opposition to capitalism that emerges in the post-Great Recession culture, and then you have Jewish culture. And so when you have universal socialism merging with Jewish culture, you get something that sounds a lot like the Bund. And this culture is emerging, yes, among young people on North American campuses with Open Hillel, or if not now when, JVP and parts of J Street. But it's also changing the face of Judaism, of the Jewish diaspora outside of the youth. And as Jews drift away from affiliation, which is a different topic that we won't get into, why is that happening, but as they drift away from affiliation with synagogues, they're ending up with different kinds of groups. Not all necessarily related to Israel, like Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, or Detroit Jews for Justice, which is hosting what promises to be a bangin' Purim party tonight at the Jam Handy, where they're taking an ancient tradition and applying it to our wonderful governor. So there's something palpable there.
Haman?
You'll have to go to find out.
Yeah.
So there's this emergence of a culture where the identity that's coming out of all of these forces is not just a political identity, but it's truly a deeper identity than a political identity. It's a cultural identity. And so one of the best ways to look at cultural identity is to listen to music. So we're going to do that, and I'm going to cherry pick a little bit. We're going to listen to two songs by Dan Cohn, who's a Detroit native. So the first song is what he calls a tradaptation, so a translation and an adaptation of Mordechai Gerbertig's March of the Unemployed, which was written in Krakow in 1930. And Mordechai served in the Austro-Hungarian army and was a member of the Bund.
Roper alumni, classic Bund example.
Right.
Talmud of student of Anna Freud.
There you go. So let's just have a listen. So Dan, he wrote this song in 2008 after listening to Obama talk about the feelingness of aloneness that people had in 2008. And he says that he writes songs like this because they're durable ways of communicating, and that you know, his line is, Yiddish isn't dead, it just needs ears. And the Jobless Corps is an example of a song that was written in the 1930s in Yiddish that sounds like it makes sense today. It doesn't really sound like it had to have been written in the 1930s. So the second song is Dumai, which I think we'll play first, this one all the way through, and then we'll talk about it. So, so Dumai is Yiddish for think. And I think this song really expresses the ambivalence or the of two minds that exists for many of the Jews that we're talking about today, about Israel and Palestine. And it also expresses the intertwinement of Jewish liberation and Palestinian liberation that is talked about in this counterculture. And the singer in this song, so the person who's supposed to be singing, is purposely ambiguous, whether it's an Israeli or a Palestinian. You can't actually really tell who the narrator is. And the frustration here matches up to what we talked about at the beginning of the talk, which is that the dream of Israel is not at all like with the reality that we find it with in 2016. And so because of this tension, there's a re-entrenchment of the idea, the concept of Doigkeit, of the Yiddish word for here-ness, which is so crucial to this subculture that we're talking about. It's not just an abstract thing to them. I mean, in fact, there's one young woman who Doigkeit is so important to her that she has it etched on her iPhone. Which you know, if you have something etched on your iPhone, you paid some money for that. It must be an important concept to you. And I think Dan talks about Doigkeit much better than I could. So we're going to play where he's discussing this concept around a show he played at the Great Synagogue of Copenhagen shortly after it was the victim of a terrorist attack. And it starts with him talking about one of his songs, which is indicative of one of the key frustrations of Open Hillel, which is that the wealthy funders are driving the boundaries of conversation around Israel, and not the people who are actually a part of these groups. And then it leads into a discussion about the Jews of Europe. And so let's just play it, and it's an exclusive. You'll only hear it here. So let me pull it up. Let's see.
Wealthy and educated elites, they are calling all Jews to Zion, and we've heard this old song before from our enemies, a ghetto for the eternal Jew. And this, one can say that this is a relic of 1904. On the other hand, you know, I just had the honor of playing. There's a group that I'm in now called the Brothers Nazaroff. We have a record coming out on Smithsonian Folkways later this year. And it's a tribute to this old Yiddish singer from the 1930s and 40s and 50s who made one record in the 50s called Prince Nazaroff. And it's a wonderful project, and it's a lot of fun. And it's not political, and it's not like edgy, and it's not angry or dark. It's kind of the antidote to the Painted Bird. And we had the honor of playing last month in Copenhagen, in the synagogue where only a couple of weeks earlier this man had been murdered in this terror attack. And it was a very sensitive time. And I didn't really know how to, you know, the Brothers Nazaroff is like a lot of fun. It's anarchic. It's wild. It's a party band. It's like the old Yiddish street music, you know. But the guys who are in this group are like, they're deep guys. You've got Michael Alpert and Soy Korolenko and Bob Cohen, Jake Schulman-Ment, Harpus Malin, you know, and we're like, we all do other kinds of music in our different groups. But we came together for this project, and here we were faced with the challenge of being the first public cultural event in this sacred space, which had been so brutally violated. And of course, security was through the roof, and there were flowers all over the street from all over the world. and everyone was so wounded, you know, and so it was such a horrible time. And here we were playing to this packed synagogue, where I'd played before with different groups, and you know, it was totally full, 19th century synagogue. They were like hanging from the rafters. And we were there to play this like wild Jewish folk music and mix in some of our old stuff, our other stuff. And you know, we played something solemn at the beginning out of, you know, remembrance and to honor this guy who'd been killed, Dan, whom I knew, whom I remembered from having been there. His family was there. The French ambassador was there. The Israeli ambassador was there. The head of the Muslim community of Copenhagen was there. A lot of young Muslims came to the show, which was incredibly touching. The show of solidarity from the Muslim communities in Europe have been really heartening to me, and I think that we need to build on those connections. And at some point, I was about to sing a song of Prince Nazarov's called Ich Flee, which is all about traveling all over the world and schlepping here and there. It's a very funny song, rhymes all these different place names. And it just came out of me, and I said, you know, there are some people who think that all the Jews of Europe should all go and live in one place, and all the Jews of the world really belong to all live, they really belong in just one place, and we should all just go to one place and all just be in this place and be safe there, because that's the only place that we can be safe and be Jews. And I just think that's ridiculous. We belong everywhere. This is our home. Europe is our home. America is our home. China, everywhere. We belong everywhere, and we should be able to be free and have a good time everywhere. And everybody just erupted, and it wasn't seen as like, oh, how could he say that? It's this big, like, drawing a line in the sand. It's like this idea that all the Jews of Europe should like leave and spit before they close the door and all move to Israel en masse is just, it's just ridiculous. It's just like a silly idea. And I got no use for it. I got no use for that discourse. And a lot of people, that heartens them, and I understand that, and I respect people who want to go and live there, and that's fine. But I don't, and maybe it's because I'm privileged. Maybe it's because I grew up in America, in Michigan, feeling 110% American and 110% Jewish, and there was no paradox there, and I don't see that as ever having been problematic for me, which isn't to say that there isn't anti-Semitism in the world, but frankly, I mean, this is...
It's right before he starts going on a cussing tirade, so we'll stop it there. So this concept that liberation is not something you go somewhere else to get, but something that you do where you are, is a concept that's coming out both in the circles that are trying to address domestic issues, and also the circles that are trying to affect what's going on in Israel. They're saying the solution is not to emigrate to Israel and try to fix it there. The solution is to stay in the U.S. and lobby the U.S. government here, and that there's a role in every place for this type of justice work. And so, you know, no culture exists in a vacuum. And so in this moment that diaspora Judaism is having, all of a sudden Bernie Sanders enters from out of nowhere. And so what's he doing to this Jewish moment? Well, think about what's recently transpired around AIPAC and around this whole issue of Islamophobia. There's a discourse in the Jewish press right now about whether or not intersectionality, which is an academic term for solidarity between different groups of oppressed people, is a good thing or not. So on the one hand, you have how intersectionality makes you stupid. And on the other hand, you have it's time for Jews to become intersectional. And you see this in the way that, I was going to play it, but I think enough of you have seen it, and we'll just talk about it. Bernie Sanders was asked by a young Muslim student, what are you going to do about Islamophobia? And the way that he framed his answer was by talking about his experience, his family's experience with the Holocaust, right? And so applying, understanding that one group's oppression is tied to another group's oppression, and that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and racism are all just one small step from each other. Okay, so let's finish reading from the Village Voice article. The Torah repeatedly reminds Jews that because we were strangers in Egypt, we are obligated to in turn welcome the stranger in the course of our lives. For Isaiah, we learn that our fasting on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is not for the purpose of making your voice to be heard on high, but rather to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke. The centuries of racial oppression and marginalization Jews have endured should reinforce these commandments, not weaken them. It's essential that we publicly enact this aspect of our Jewish identity and choose wisely the political and social agendas we mobilize our Jewishness to advance. As Warsaw Ghetto Uprising leader Marek Edelman said, to be a Jew meant always being with the oppressed and never the oppressors. And this is Doikite. This is the essential piece of how Bernie Sanders expresses his Jewishness and his politics. When Bernie Sanders says, we're all in this together, okay, what he's saying, what he's expressing is the echad in the Shema, the essential oneness that's so important to Jewishness. And what Bernie Sanders is offering Jews is finally someone who reflects their actual beliefs in the establishment. And there's a really good comic, which I'll ask Fran to hand out, called Stuart, the Jewish Turtle Feels the Burn. And it expresses this reflection in a way that only a comic could. So here, Fran, why don't you give me half of them, Fran?
Oh, on the other side.
So just take a minute and read this. Okay. So what we have with this is, what's really striking about this is that Stuart the Jewish Turtle, if you've never read this comic, he calls everyone an anti-Semite. That's his shtick. Okay? But again, this is like the Jewish community throwing the bagel at Bernie Sanders' face. So Stuart